Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if the games and tests we use to measure a child's intelligence are fair for everyone everywhere? Today we're diving into a fascinating study that tackles this exact question. Think about it. Most of the tests we use to measure how smart kids are were created in places like the US or Europe. But what happens when we try to use them in very different cultures, with different ways of life and different languages? Do they still tell us the truth about a child's abilities? This paper explores exactly that. By creating and testing a new set of intelligence tests, specifically designed for children in lower and middle-income countries, like Ghana. The core idea behind this research is pretty simple. We need better ways to measure how kids are developing, especially when they're not in a typical Western classroom. So, these researchers, Joseph Coffey and Elizabeth Spelke, took ideas from games and puzzles, usually done in labs, the kind that test things like how well you understand numbers, space, or even how your brain works when you have to switch tasks, and turn them into a testing kit for young children. They wanted to see if these lab games worked well in a real-world setting in Ghana, measuring kids at different ages and seeing if the tests actually measured what they were supposed to. Now, why is this so important? Well, imagine you are trying to see if an educational program really helps kids learn. If your testing tools aren't fair or accurate for everyone, you might get misleading results. You might wrongly think a program isn't working, or even worse, that it is working when it is not. This study aimed to create tools that could be used all over the world to accurately measure development from infancy all the way up to school age. They wanted to tap into abilities that they believe are fundamental and emerge early in life. Abilities that predict later success in academics, no matter where a child grows up. So how did they do it? They created a big set of games and tasks, divided into different areas like language, numbers, spatial reasoning, understanding others' minds, and what they call executive functions, which is basically your brain's control center for things like attention and planning. They tested over 1,400 children in Ghana, ranging from very young babies all the way up to 7.5 years old. They specifically focused on children whose parents had not received a special education scholarship because they wanted to avoid any bias from the outside intervention. The testing happened over several years, at different ages for these children, so they could see how scores changed over time, and if early scores predicted later ones. One of the coolest parts is how they adapted these lab tasks. They knew that just translating a test wouldn't work. They worked with local surveyors, people from those communities, to make sure the games made sense and used things that children would recognize, like familiar animals or even the layout of their own village for map games. They even swapped out things like candy or cookie for local treats. This was crucial to make sure the kids weren't failing because they didn't understand the materials, but because they genuinely didn't have the skill the test was designed to measure. They also made sure the materials were tough and could be used outdoors, because that is where a lot of life happens in these settings. The way they administered the tests also changed with age. For the very youngest kids, around 1.5 years old, it was more like playing with toys and responding with gestures. As the children got older, the tasks became more like sitting at the table, or even using laptops with more verbal responses and keyboard inputs. This difference in how tasks are delivered is a really important detail to keep in mind when we look at the results. Now, how did they know if their tests were any good? They looked at a few things. First, they checked for something called internal consistency. Think of this as making sure different parts of the same test all measure the same thing. If you have a test about numbers, all the number questions should give a similar sense of a child's number ability. They used something called Cronbach's alpha for this. And if the number was low, it meant the test wasn't very reliable. They also looked at whether kids were performing just by guessing, or if their scores were actually above what chance would predict. And here is where it gets interesting. For the youngest kids, the 1.5-year-olds, the results were pretty disappointing. The tests had very low reliability and consistency. Many kids weren't even scoring above chance. It seemed like these infant tasks, even though they're based on lab studies, just weren't working well in this real-world Ghanaian context. But as the children got older, things improved dramatically. By age 3.5, the results were much better. The overall battery consistency was high, and almost all kids were scoring above chance. Specific domains like language and numeracy showed good reliability. They also looked at whether performance in one task predicted performance in similar tasks later on. So, a child who did well in a number task at 3.5 years was likely to do well in similar number tasks at 5.5 years. This is a really good sign that the tests were measuring something real and stable about the child's development. By the time the children were 5.5 years old, the tests were performing even better. Most domains showed good reliability. And again, early performance predicted later performance strongly. It is worth noting that some specific tasks, like DNA physics and theory of mind tasks still showed poor performance even at these older ages. This suggests that some concepts or ways of testing them might be trickier to adapt than others. And at 7.5 years old, the battery was performing really well. Almost all tasks and domains demonstrated good reliability and validity. This shows that by around this age, the adapted lab tasks were effectively measuring what they were designed to measure in this cultural context. So, what is the big takeaway here? The researchers found that their approach worked remarkably well, especially for older children. They were able to create tests that were reliable, meaning they consistently measured something, and valid, meaning they measured what they intended to measure. These tests, adapted from lab-based cognitive science, could actually capture individual differences in children's abilities in areas like language, numbers, and spatial reasoning in Ghana. This is a huge deal for researchers and organizations working on child development interventions in low and middle-income countries. However, the study also highlights some important limitations. The infant tasks, those for 1.5-year-olds, didn't perform well. This could be due to several reasons. One is that infants are harder to test in any setting. They respond more slowly and get bored easily. But in a busy outdoor environment, it is even tougher. It is also possible that cultural nuances about how children interact with unfamiliar adults or how they interpret instructions played a role, especially for younger children. For example, a task that assumes a child always wants more toys might not hold true everywhere. The paper also points out that familiarity with media and technology could influence results. Some children were uncomfortable with laptops, which might have affected their performance on those tasks. And of course, differences in preschool experiences play a big role. Children who have attended preschool are more accustomed to taking tests from adults outside their family, which can make a big difference. The researchers acknowledged that they couldn't directly compare their tests to other established assessments like the IDELA assessment due to time constraints. This is a common challenge in field research. They also weren't able to definitively say if their tests measured truly universal cognitive abilities or more context. Specific skills that might be influenced by things like parental education. This highlights the ongoing challenge of creating truly culture-free assessments. But despite these challenges, the study is a major step forward. By making all their testing materials and data freely available, they're paving the way for other researchers to build on their work, adapt these tests for different cultures, and ultimately get a clearer picture of cognitive development worldwide. What this tells us is that while creating standardized, fair assessments across incredibly diverse cultures is incredibly difficult, it is not impossible. It requires careful adaptation, collaboration with local communities, and a willingness to learn from what doesn't work as much as what does. The future of truly understanding child development globally relies on this kind of thoughtful, inclusive research. What do you think about these findings? Does it change how you think about intelligence tests? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science stories, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.